child and adult analyst here at the Institute. And I asked Dr. Eve Maram to present because of my own personal familial history with such pathology, schizoaffective schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. And when I read her book, I was taken in and felt compelled to have her here to speak to us. Something that I think we should all know about, but that we don't often delve into enough, I think. Dr. Eve Maram is a clinical and forensic psychologist and a Diplomate Jungian Analyst in private practice in Orange, California. She's a member of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts and the C.G. Jung Institute of Santa Fe, as well as the International Association of Analytical Psychology. She has authored 2 books, Psychopathy Within from Chiron 2016, and this book she's presenting on today, The Schizophrenia Complex from Chiron as well in 2022, as well as several chapters and articles. She has presented this material in trainings internationally. So please help me welcome Dr. Eve Maram.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Christoph. And I'm very pleased to see you here in front of me and out there on Zoom. This isn't an easy topic to show up for, so I appreciate your presence. I'm gonna start. For the music, I click right.
People are strange when you're a stranger. Faces look ugly when you're alone. Women seem wicked when you're unwanted. Streets are uneven when you're down. When you're strange, faces come out of the rain. When you're strange, no one remembers your name. When you're strange, when you're strange, when you're strange, people are strange.
Most of us remember that song, right? This wasn't an easy book to write. I would not have done so if I didn't feel I had no choice. In the Jungian world, that's not unusual, of course. The places we don't want to go are often those to which we are called, and know to respond to that call with creativity in order to keep going. So this book seems to generate the very complex that it describes. I had a resistance to writing it. Others responded less than enthusiastically to the idea. And I want to talk with you about this book, why I wrote it, and some of the main ideas, what it means to me, why I think it's important. So part of this presentation, as I go along, will be my doing some brief readings from my book. Often these excerpts are on the PowerPoint slides, so we'll drop into these excerpts periodically, and then I will talk about them. We'll do some check-ins with you to pause and process the material. And as Christoph mentioned, today's schedule, we have 3 hours, but we will take breaks about every hour, and there will be an opportunity for questions and dialogue at the end. To start, I would like you to briefly, we're going to close eyes, and I would like you to think about when you have encountered anyone with what we call schizophrenia. So as you are closing your eyes, see what comes up. What was your reaction to this encounter? Inner and outer. I'd like you to save that felt image, and we will revisit it later. As with many a Jungian venture, this one began with a dream. And this is from the book. 7 years ago, or was it a lifetime, I had a dream that I am now reminded of as I begin this book on the Schizophrenia Complex that I put off writing for so long. I was alone in an underground area of a large, unfamiliar building, maybe a YMCA, needing to complete my workout by diving into a small, round, rimmed pool of cold, dark water in the center of a small, windowless, dimly lit room. I was anxious and torn as I felt that in order to complete what I expected of myself, I needed to dive in and start swimming. But the prospect was terrifying. Even in the dream, although I could not bring myself to actually take the plunge, I could vividly imagine what it would be like to be swimming tight laps in this narrow, black, seemingly bottomless sinkhole, far from the light of day, alone and claustrophobic. At the time, upon reflection, I worried that this dream implied I was less open to my unconscious than I prided myself on being as a good Jungian. What I perceive now is that this was a necessarily unsettling prospective message from my own depths, something far from my conscious attitude, and certainly not arriving by choice. That was March, and on July 2nd, my adult son had an unexpected psychotic break, leaving the rest of us metaphorically doing laps in the darkness, trying to get back on solid ground. In the years since, my journey has involved developing a relationship with schizophrenia and our complexes around it. First through my son, who has blessedly returned from the unreachable depths, and then more recently, as we have all had some time to breathe, through the rest of our family, all of whom love him and are so deeply affected by his trajectory. It is the feeling dimension of this experience which constitutes my focus here. My son did not undergo his deep dive alone. The feelings associated with his journey continue to impact our lives, along with the unsolicited onus of trying to shift forever an unbidden hereditary burden, the previously unspoken complex in our family, generated by the experience of having a family member with schizophrenia. I'll talk more about that. On some level, which I explain more about later, that complex affects families for generations, both literally and psychically. My Jungian orientation gave me at least the potential to broaden my perspective and make meaning of this extraordinary, painful turn of events. This is a lonely and unpopular topic, not one I would ever have chosen, as I mentioned. The general response, as I also mentioned, was silence or avoidance. Sometimes that resistance was unconscious, sometimes it was very obvious. I'm sure you're all familiar with this beautiful quote. This is at the beginning of my book, but it is, of course, from Jung's The Red Book, very relevant to our conversation this morning. I'm going to read it, so bear with me. I know you can all read, but sometimes it helps to bring it into the room. Be silent and listen. Have you recognized your madness, and do you admit it? Have you noticed that all your foundations are completely mired in madness? Do you not want to recognize your madness and welcome it in a friendly manner? You wanted to accept everything, so accept madness too. Let the light of your madness shine, and it will suddenly dawn on you. Madness is not to be despised and not to be feared, but instead, you should give it life. If you want to find paths, you should also not spurn madness, since it makes up such a great part of your nature. Be glad that you can recognize it, for you will thus avoid becoming its victim. Madness is a special form of the spirit and clings to all teachings and philosophies, but even more to daily life, since life itself is full of craziness and at bottom utterly illogical. Man strives toward reason only so that he can make rules for himself. Life itself has no rules. That is its mystery and its unknown law. What you call knowledge is an attempt to impose something comprehensible on life. Pardon the little tech issues here. Okay, here we go. So a complex is an emotionally charged knot of largely unconscious feelings and beliefs that has a powerful influence on perceptions and behaviors. It is a pod of feeling-toned ideas or images that accumulate around certain archetypes, meaning unconscious, universally inherited human patterns of thought or behavior, literal, symbolic, and psychic. At its core, the complex occurs in response to an experience that is in some way archetypal. When complexes are constellated, they are invariably accompanied by affect and remain relatively autonomous. Jung says that a complex, quote unquote, is the image of a certain psychic situation which is strongly accentuated emotionally and is incompatible with the habitual attitude of consciousness. My way of understanding a schizophrenia complex is different from Jung's. Of course, there's some overlap, but it's different. And that's an important part of what I'm hoping to share with you today. The schizophrenia complex, as I conceptualize it, is not the phenomenon of schizophrenia itself viewed as a complex, but concerns the emotionally charged thoughts and feelings generated in response to the schizophrenic condition. The archetypal core of such a feeling-toned complex might be the image of chaos. And that archetypal image of chaos is an image of our felt relationship with the unconscious. Okay, I want to go to the next slide here. Shall I try, Christoph? We did it. Good job. As I stated in the article, Dialoguing with My Demon, which was in Psych Perspectives back in 2016, I wrote that article and I thought, good, I'm done with this topic. I don't have to do it anymore, right? So this is a quote from that piece. I have come to perceive schizophrenia as less about a split mind, as the etymology suggests, than an unruly, expanded one. The visions and dreams, the lack of differentiation between the dream world and the waking one that characterize schizophrenia reflect the diffuse vastness of the unconscious, unfettered by the constraints and the organizing functions of consciousness. The unconscious as a construct both repels and lures us. Schizophrenia generally just repels us. It represents unconsciousness unbounded, lost in space, a separation of the mind while the body is eerily still before us, staring at or through us from that other intangible dimension on the street corner, strolling lopsidedly down Venice Beach, sleeping on cardboard in the hospital waiting room, the therapy office, or our living room. Who would face or even visit such a monster voluntarily? After all, that monster represents the aspects of ourselves we would most like to avoid. Our own capacity for madness, the mad state of our limited existence, the universal human reality of our eventual absorption unto death, the great unsolvable mystery of our very being. Schizophrenia is described in current clinical psychiatry as a constellation of signs and symptoms that may include hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, and grossly disorganized or abnormal motor behavior, including catatonia, where you don't move. These are referred to as positive symptoms because they're feelings and behaviors that are overt, observable, and atypical of the individual's normal functioning. The condition also includes negative symptoms that are often overlooked. These represent a reduction or loss of normal functioning in some way, a blunting of affect, poverty of speech and thought, apathy, anhedonia, which is joylessness, lack of social drive or interest, avolition, lost motivation, and inattention to input from the external world. Several generally recognized subtypes of schizophrenia are paranoid, catatonic, and undifferentiated or hebephrenic, which is childlike. Although the current Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5-TR, no longer includes these categorical distinctions, I find them helpful. Some types of symptoms show more than others, but a commonality is the inner chaos experienced by someone with an ego that is submerged in the unconscious. One way this chaos manifests is in the form of unregulated affect or behavior that may be extroverted, introverted, or both. This characteristic is particularly relevant to the schizophrenia complex, since it's usually the odd behavior reflective of inner chaos that triggers a strong emotional response in those who encounter it. We notice odd behavior or speech. Our relationship, bear with me, I'm not just going to read slides the whole time. Our relationship with our inner madness, with the unconscious, has everything to do with what schizophrenia means in our culture and in our psyches, both personal and collective. Individually and collectively, our avoidance of this aspect of human existence is significant. Fear, avoidance, and blind hatred, othering, create a marginalization that damages at least as deeply as a scattered mind, if not more so. It is a painful reality that for some people bearing the diagnosis, the reactions of people around them are more distressing than the condition itself. Inevitably, carrying others around such an individual are affected by stigmatizing attitudes toward the condition, embarrassment, etc. In the final analysis, our collective and personal revulsion for our own irrational aspects is perhaps the primary illness, the manifestation and projection of which is carried by those among us who, due to ill fate or genetics or both, have no choice but to be more fully drafted into the deep zones of the unconscious than the rest of us. These unwitting warriors manifest an archetypal image of alienation. Okay. I'm sorry. Their victories are too rarely understood or acknowledged. This is a diagram from Edinger's Ego and Archetype on page 5. I approach it in, I'm using it in a slightly different context than he initially presented it, but I think it's a beautiful image of the ego's submergence in the unconscious. So the schizophrenia complex is both intimately subjective and archetypal, affecting everyone differently. The experience of all we mean by schizophrenia and our encounters with it can be conceptualized as the ego's submergence in the unconscious. And that relationship has everything to do with what I'm hoping to convey to you today, is that it's, we all have a relationship with our unconscious, and the extent to which our ego experience is differentiated from that makes all the difference in the world in terms of what we call a schizophrenic condition or not. So it's not a matter of either or, yes or no, it's a matter of degree. The schizophrenia complex can be understood in terms of a profound ripple effect from the personal to the collective, the numinous, and the symbolic. I mentioned that Jung's definition of a schizophrenia complex is different from mine. As Jungian analyst Daryl Sharp explained, Jung believed many psychoses, and particularly schizophrenia, were psychogenic, resulting from an abaissement du niveau mental, a French, lowering of consciousness, sorry, Christophe, and an ego too weak to resist the onslaught of unconscious contents. The complex of an individual with schizophrenia, as Jung described it, is radically dissociated from any unifying personality, a split that reaches the organic structure of the individual. This condition differs from Jung's definition of a complex in general as feeling toned. Jung seemed to refer to a schizophrenia complex as the state of schizophrenia itself within an individual bearing its symptoms rather than an emotional reaction to the condition itself involving unresolved feelings and beliefs. And in my perspective, a person who has psychosis, who has schizophrenia, may actually have what I call a schizophrenia complex once they have recovered enough consciousness about their own affect in order to identify what it feels like to have gone through what they did. And a big part of that is how the world responds to them, what it has done to them. So it's a conscious response.
Can I ask a question? So that would require the ego to come out of, to disidentify with the, to be able to have some perspective and
perfect. And that's where the illustration from, Yes.
Thank you. Sorry.
Jung described that complexes in schizophrenia, in contrast to those in neurotic disorders, are so radically dissociated from ego that they cannot be integrated into consciousness, or can only reach consciousness at all with the remission of the psychosis, quote unquote, like a mirror broken into splinters. He writes, a neurosis is characterized by the relative autonomy of its complexes. But in schizophrenia, the complexes have become disconnected and autonomous fragments. This definition of a schizophrenia complex differs from other feeling-toned complexes. The degree to which a complex is feeling-toned as opposed to cut off and compartmentalized from ego consciousness reflects the difference between contexts that are neurotic and therefore accessible and psychotic, i.e. split off and dissociated. According to Jung, complexes can span from normal to psychotic depending on the degree of incompatibility with our egoic identity. A normal complex would involve affective material that is relatively accessible and not completely disconnected from one's awareness. A complex in an individual with schizophrenia would be autonomous to the utmost. This is according to Jung. To have complexes is in itself normal, but if the complexes are incompatible, that part of the personality which is too contrary to the conscious part becomes split off. If the split reaches the organic structure, the dissociation is a psychosis, a schizophrenic condition, as the term denotes. Each complex then lives an existence of its own, with no personality left to tie them together. As Jungian analyst Daryl Sharp explained, Jung believed that many psychoses, and particularly schizophrenia, were psychogenic, and I read that quote, I'm not going to botch the French again, lowering of consciousness. Metaphorically drowning in a schizophrenia complex where the ego is engulfed in the unconscious would thus be an extreme example of Jung's timeless quote about how rather than we having our complexes have us. Psychotic fragmentation implies absolute disconnection from the ego and its conscious feelings and emotions. The complex of an individual with schizophrenia, as Jung described it, is radically dissociated from any unifying personality, a split that reaches the organic structure of the individual. This condition differs from his definition of a complex as feeling-toned, as follows. It is the image of a certain situation which is strongly accentuated emotionally and is moreover incompatible with the habitual attitude of consciousness. This image has a powerful inner coherence. It has its own wholeness and in addition, a relatively high degree of autonomy so that it is subject to the control of the conscious mind to only a limited extent and therefore behaves like an animated foreign body in the sphere of consciousness. That is, whereas he describes most complexes as knots of incompatible emotions that differ from one's ego-syntonic persona, relatively unconscious but accessible to ego consciousness, his definition of a schizophrenia complex is qualitatively different in its characteristic of extreme dissociation from ego consciousness. Hence, Jung seemed to refer to a schizophrenia complex as the state of schizophrenia itself within an individual bearing its symptoms rather than an emotional reaction to the condition involving unresolved feelings and beliefs. If having a schizophrenia complex is synonymous with having schizophrenia, then there is no continuum involved in the definition, no gradated spectrum of consciousness. One is either in a state of psychotic dissociation or not. Jung's definition of a schizophrenia complex describes the extreme dissociation from ego consciousness that characterizes the psychotic end of the spectrum. We're stuck again. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you for yours.
The tech gods and I have gone several rounds. So the late Jungian analyst Errol Shalit discussed the complex as having a task, this is interesting, to serve as a vehicle and vessel of transformation, whereby the archetypal essence is brought into living reality. In someone with a strong enough ego, the process can occur fairly readily. The complexes enable a relatively smooth transition from the archetypal to the personal. However, for someone in a psychotic state, archetypal contents flood the ego to such an extent that the vessel of transformation cannot hold. As illustration, Shalit referred to Jung's distinction between soul complexes and spirit complexes, the former being more like a regular feeling-toned complex, and the latter being more like Jung's description of a schizophrenia complex, i.e., radically disconnected from ego consciousness. Jung compared the experience of these two kinds of complexes with the primitive belief in souls and spirits. Souls correspond to the autonomous complexes of the personal unconscious, and spirits to those of the collective unconscious. Broader and wilder. Ha! It worked. Thus, soul complexes are essentially useful to the individual's developing sense of identity, since they can be assimilated into consciousness, whereas spirit complexes are associated with psychosis, with an ego too weak to withstand the archetypal world, and so the complex cannot perform its transformative task. This differentiation helps to explain Jung's ideas about the differences between feeling-toned complexes, which would be like soul complexes, and what he calls a schizophrenia complex, which would be a spirit complex. Jung did not discuss complexes that arise in response to encountering schizophrenia in another person, or complexes in people with schizophrenia that are feeling-toned and not fully split off, which does happen because it's not usually a straight line in terms of the condition. It's like a serpent in and out of the deep water. I do not make the distinction Jung did between the schizophrenia complex characteristic of someone with schizophrenia and the normal or neurotic complexes of others impacted by the condition, which I also refer to as a schizophrenia complex. The barely accessible, unresolved feelings and beliefs we hold about any encounter with madness, even a personal one, are often at least as devastating a challenge as the experience itself, to ourselves and to others impacted by our attitude. And of course, this is not just personal, but collective. Schizophrenia itself is not a complex as I am defining it, which is different from Jung. What we call schizophrenia involves incursions from the unconscious, affective and energetic experience disconnected from consciousness. In contrast, the schizophrenia complex, as I am describing it, has to do with the thoughts and emotions that arise from a conscious experience of encountering schizophrenia. Thus, the complex can occur in an individual who has suffered psychosis themselves and recovered enough ego consciousness to recall, reflect upon, and retrieve ego-associated affect with some insight. The complex is also triggered in others whose lives are impacted by those who suffer schizophrenia. This is a quote from a training analyst, Barry Williams, who's absolutely wonderful and was a tremendous influence on me during my training in Santa Fe years ago. he makes this comment on the potential for something transformative in the undoing of one's life, at least as one has perceived it to be. The cure for psychopathology is to unpathologize it. The just so-ness of life is the beauty of it, even if the ego is experiencing it as beautiful or unbearable. There's no increase in consciousness without sacrifice. Sacrifice is part of individuation, and sacrifice is archetypal. You have to go through the undoing of your life in order to have your life. Isn't that beautiful? Mm-hmm. And honestly, of course, this doesn't just pertain to schizophrenia. Islands of clarity. My son told me that when he was on Venice Beach in a psychotic state, he recalled a sense of joy, freedom, independence like I hadn't felt before, open, strong, outgoing, adventurous with my mind. He also described, quote unquote, being nuts, believing wholeheartedly in things that aren't real. I miss it in a way, and I don't. When I was not on meds, I had more energy, but I couldn't live in society. The dream world is fun, but I enjoy having stability. In hindsight about that period, many years later, he reflected, I was in pain the whole time I was in psychosis. He had restored that lost affect to his ego consciousness. Another way of putting that is that he was not aware of that when he was in it. An individual caught in the maelstrom of madness may be unaware of their plight while psychotic, but once such a plight becomes conscious, even a glimpse of ordinary reality entails some degree of confrontation with the terror of experiencing extreme alienation. Most individuals with schizophrenia are not in a constant state of psychosis, but emerge periodically, experiencing what a colleague calls islands of clarity. Perhaps in those clear moments, such an individual is most susceptible to what I'm referring to as the schizophrenia complex. As consciousness of the labyrinth in which one is lost means facing both the terrifying raw otherness of one's own inner state and one standing in the outer world. The resulting anguish is more neurotic than psychotic, a form of ego suffering. We are disturbed by how disturbed we are, rather than being completely lost in the dark without a compass. These islands of clarity represent not only periods of cognitive dissonance, but a potential restoration of the affect that was lost during psychosis. When someone in a psychotic state begins to regain their ego initially, they may be able to remember details of the experience they've been through, but the associated affect may still be absent. When such an individual begins to recover their true feelings and emotions about that experience, they may be horrified, saddened, enraged, ashamed, or overwhelmed. In response, they are likely to retreat back into the oblivion of the netherworld, especially if they're not on medication. I am using the term schizophrenia complex in a way akin to our typical understanding of a complex as feeling toned, accessible to some ego consciousness, although relatively compartmentalized. Defined thus, the schizophrenia complex in a schizophrenic individual involves that individual's conscious feelings and emotions about his or her psychotic condition. For example, when someone with schizophrenia starts to become aware of being looked at quizzically by others and to feel and express the emotional impact of such observation, there is an opening of sorts. The affect consciously experienced by the individual is then accessible as a feeling-toned complex. The associated affect is no longer split off, fully autonomous, and compartmentalized from consciousness. This is another point I hope you will take with you. As such, to be able to be in a complex is a sign of recovery for someone with schizophrenia. To have a complex requires an ego that is not fully submerged in the unconscious. It requires a degree of consciousness, the ability to reflect and to name affects. Where are we on time? We're pretty good. The component of my family legacy. These are two good quotes from Jung, I think. Psychologically, the central point of a human personality is the place where the ancestors are reincarnated. And nothing influences children more than the silent facts in the background. So this book is inevitably about my own schizophrenia complex and also my family's. Jung knew that family complexes are handed down in a form of psychic inheritance. My son's illness has an ancestral component, according to what I've been able to discover, along with what, by my mother's choosing, I will never know. Whatever that legacy is in its entirety flows through me as well. Jung wrote, and I'm going to quote again, psychologically, the central point of the human personality is that place where the ancestors are reincarnated, and that's kind of what that means. And that silent influence, of course, which, if it remains unconscious, of course, will show up in ways that are unbidden and usually not pleasant. The secret encapsulated trauma surrounding schizophrenia in my mother's family was an unspoken part of my psychic legacy that surfaced when I was forced to deal with the emergence of schizophrenia in my own. I choose to illuminate that history toward healing our family schizophrenia complex. Secrecy has not worked. So British author Nathan Filer, a mental health nurse, alludes to the incredible impact of schizophrenia, even the word, upon the immediate sufferer, but also the rest of us. He's hopeful that it's possible to have a shift in consciousness around schizophrenia while honoring the archetypal scope of this problem, emphasizing its emotional impact. He writes this. What a word, huh? I wonder if you might consider trying something for me. Say the word schizophrenia out loud a few times, not beneath your breath. Really say it. Say it loud enough that you feel self-conscious, that you worry someone will hear. Say it loud enough that someone might hear. Feel the shape of it. Stay with it. Think about what that word evokes in you. What thoughts does it arrive with? What feelings? Please remember this as you do so. Whole lives have disappeared beneath that word. I don't usually have groups do this, but we're a cozy group here, and I, out in Zoom land, you're on your own. Let's do it. Let's close our eyes. I'm going to count to 3, and then I want you to just say the word nice and loud. We'll just do it once, not several times, and then we'll return. Okay? So close eyes. 1, 2, 3. Schizophrenia! I just realized that not only have I not asked groups to do that, I haven't done it. And it makes me want to cry. Any of you here want to share anything?
I'm very shaken up, and it was really scary.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
All right. All right. Any encounter with schizophrenia carries an invitation to get in touch with our own madness. We would rather refuse if given a choice. My sinkhole dream, described in the preface, presents just such a justifiable terror. The challenge of diving into that black bottomless pool is not like walking a child to swim class and encouraging them to be unafraid, coaxing a step toward a positive development. Contrarily, it could represent a psychic dissolution that is not in service to individuation at all, but a leap into nothing for nothing. At least not for a part of our existence that we can know or own. Who in their right mind would choose that? In such an instance, wariness is healthy, maybe a healthy defense against being overwhelmed, against the threat of disintegration. The desire to avoid such an experience is reasonable, even self-preserving. It is to be afraid of the loss of our very sense of self. That dive into the bottomless dark waters represents an annihilation of consciousness, of the ego, the strength we work hard for, need, and count on. We want to stay in that brightly lit room for understandable and legitimate reasons. So in my dream, I recounted in the preface, why was I tempted and even cajoled by myself, the dream ego, my inner gym teacher, to dive into the pool and do my exercises while every fiber of my being pulled away from the dreaded task? Perhaps because something in me, in us, does compel us to know more, to bring to consciousness what we can from the seeming black void of the unknown. That inner dialogue does seem in the service of individuation and may in fact be prerequisite. Here we have yet another tension of opposites, that safe, brightly lit room of ego consciousness juxtaposed with the boundless reaches of the dark unconscious. The nature of our human existence inevitably bridges both, and failure to balance the tension between these realities can be mortally destructive. The challenge of navigating these opposites is enough to strike justifiable terror into anyone's heart. So, along the lines of an archetypal challenge, we humans are inherently confronted with the dramatic opposites of order and chaos, and the challenge to regulate the interplay between ego development and the unconscious in ways both personal and collective. One difference between the archetypal contents of the collective unconscious and other contents, such as those of the personal unconscious, is that sometimes walls are life-saving. While walls may have a negative connotation, as though we are avoiding something that should be included or faced, boundaries and differentiation are generally acknowledged as positive functions, helping us to keep ourselves together. Jungians tend to favor the idea of emulating Jung's own deep dive into the unconscious. Approaches to this diving process include efforts to humanize the intolerable archetypal aspects of the unconscious. Sometimes that's possible, at least partially. Maybe the answer to my sinkhole dream is to continue honoring not knowing what to do, if anything. There was no one right response in that dream, but the confrontation with the choice to dive in was necessary. Now I remain in that space of not knowing. That stance is important to me in depotentiating my own schizophrenia complex. It's the gift that keeps on giving. This might be conceptualized in terms of the transcendent function. Conformation, standing in the liminal space of between versus either or, and actively waiting. The unchosen turn of life events, my son's schizophrenia, has catapulted me into having to engage in an unexpected development of my own experience. Our personal and collective relationship with schizophrenia poses an archetypal challenge. Responding to what we know as schizophrenia requires holding and navigating a tension of opposites between order and chaos, the ego and the unconscious. Even conscious recognition of that quandary may manifest as a voracious schizophrenia complex, a knot of unresolvable thoughts and emotions that represent a failure to hold the tension. For example, as I've mentioned, siblings of people with the condition often describe extreme anxiety and fear about whether they too are going crazy, and as a result may become hypervigilant and insecure about their own reality testing. A former psychological assistant of mine whose brother had schizophrenia described the following scene that occurred soon after the jarring onset of his symptoms. She entered her dark apartment at the end of a workday to hear the murmur of muffled voices. For a brief, agonizing moment, she was sure it was her own auditory hallucinations, rather than the radio she had left on that morning. Such a complex can occur both in those closest to an individual suffering schizophrenic symptoms and in collective entities and institutions. It can also occur in the symptomatic individual themselves when the mist clears and re-entry looms. It can occur anywhere, on the street corner, in the park, or in the grocery line. The world is a stage, and these afflicted players are often strikingly noticeable due to their bizarre behavior. In general, no one wants to be so othered or to be close to one so othered. Furthermore, if one is connected to another so afflicted, that connection can potentially invoke judgment, fear, and rejection by others, rendering that affiliation a source of emotional angst. Such a relationship can be fraught with conflict between deep love and terror, heart-wrenching compassion, and the desire for avoidance. Jung had an extremely rare ability to navigate these murky waters and keep his ship afloat. During the period of his life when he was experiencing vivid encounters with his unconscious, both personal and collective, while reeling from his break with Freud and creating the material we now know as the Red Book, he consciously engaged the content that was erupting in him and gave it creative outlet. This included spending dedicated time daily on the shore of Lake Zurich, collecting, as he put it, suitable stones and constructing cottages, a castle, a whole village. He adds, I went on with my building game after the noon meal every day whenever the weather permitted. As soon as I was through eating, I began playing and continued to do so until the patients arrived. This schedule clearly demonstrates deliberately holding the tension of the opposites, conscious and unconscious, inner and outer. And I think it's a good time for a break. Okay, so let's take 10 minutes.
Yeah, so we're going to be back at 10:05.
Good. Welcome back. So although it's described as a thought disorder, the lived experience of schizophrenia is mired in the realm of affect, both for those afflicted whose own conscious feeling associations are lost, and for those others that are affected by their loved ones' heartbreaking unavailability. Schizophrenia attacks relatedness through a confluence of factors, including emotional disconnection and the feelings of otherness, shame, and stigma that surround this experience for everyone it touches. It's a very lonely topic. An individual suffering these symptoms experiences a terrible inner alienation, even if they're not aware of the feeling aspect of it when they are in the grips of it. But it's also a loss like no other for those who are close to this person or were close, love them. So that is one relational dimension of experiencing schizophrenia in self or other. And then, of course, it goes broader in terms of our response to people we don't even know that we see on the street and cross to the other side to avoid. And then, as I mentioned previously, collectively, institutions that do not have policies that generous or available the way they're needed for these people or their families. And then, of course, the archetypal layer, which I think is something that deserves our utmost respect and attention. This is a quote from my son. When I was psychotic, I was angry at anyone who came in my way, so my feelings toward you were ultimately defiant. I look back in retrospect and realize that it was about having freedom to do what I wanted to do, and I didn't have a liking for rules and discipline. Once I regained some reality to my life, I was calmer and more patient, which in turn gave me the ability to live and care for you and the ones I love. As time went on and I continued to take medication, I began to feel the connection we once had. I would say that respect is the one aspect that is most prevalent with me toward you and the whole family. When I was psychotic, I really didn't think about anybody but myself. That has completely changed as well. I look forward to helping others and you, and also myself. There is positive communication that is caring and understanding, along with being able to sympathize. So that's the voice of someone who has returned from the depths in that moment. Mm-hmm. My son was living an archetypal life. His car was his chariot, and when it was gone, we found it and took it in a failed attempt to get him home. It did not matter. He wandered. He soared with the angels, and when he landed, he was severely sunburned. Echoes of Icarus. The physical injuries he had sustained suddenly came to his conscious attention. Re-entry was slow and painful. To quote him, from the arrival side of the gaping brink of his journey. First and most importantly, I had the love and support of my family. I don't know what I would be doing without the love and support of you guys. I put myself in many situations that made me stuck on an island, and you gave me a lifeboat to living. Christophe. What reels us back to land from the far reaches of the unconscious? There is no one answer. Perhaps we have to come apart in order to reconstitute the lives we were meant to have, sacrificing the script written by ego, as I was challenged to do, or salvaging an ego flooded by the unconscious, as my son was challenged to do. Sometimes it is love that reels us back. Inevitably, sometimes it is the opposite. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, Jung included the following from Freud's posthumous writings about 2 basic instincts, Eros and death. The aim of Eros is to establish ever greater unities and to preserve them thus. In short, to bind together. The aim of the destructive instinct is, on the contrary, to undo connections and to destroy things. For this reason, we also call it the death instinct. Jung comments, life, like any other process, has a beginning and an end, and every beginning is also the beginning of the end. What Freud probably means is the essential fact that every process is a phenomenon of energy, and that all energy can proceed only from the tension of opposites. The complicated interplay of energies that resulted in the return of my son to solid ground undoubtedly included both destruction and love. Both were necessary. There was the destruction of the old order of our lives, inner and outer, and the power of love that allowed us to remain connected through that arduous journey. So most of us, all of us, I will guess, are aware of Jung's history with schizophrenia, which was so fundamental to his thinking and the development of his theories. So the Burkholzli, and that's it there, was a psychiatric hospital in Zurich where Jung did a psychiatric residency, actually living on the second floor under the mentorship of the hospital's director, Eugen Bleuler, in the early 1900s. That immersive work taught him about the mythopoetic nature of the unconscious. One defining difference between Freud and Jung was Jung's work with the psychotic patients, which opened him to the mystery, chaos, and formlessness of the unconscious. Jung's courage to delve into this formidable milieu, inner and outer, with curiosity and openness, was absolutely at the core of the soul of his work. Emil Kraepelin's theory, which was, he called it dementia praecox, a form of early dementia, was very different from that of Eugen Bleuler, who was the one who developed the association experiments with Jung, and also influenced the medical model, which developed the term the schizophrenias. That's in a book, Michael Escamilla wrote a book called The Schizophrenias that talks a lot about that piece of history. So Eugen Bleuler's approach was a significant departure from Kraepelin's because it opened the possibility that psychotic patients' hallucinations and delusions had meaning and were not simply byproducts of neurological degeneration. And then Jung, of course, took this further, bridging the hallucinations of some patients to archetypal themes. And that's where he got the idea of not only complexes, but the collective unconscious, certainly the foundational concepts of his work. I will talk a little about Solar Phallus Man, that classic example that kind of gave him the taproot into this whole idea of hallucinations of some patients having archetypal meanings. First, I'm going to talk a little about the word association experiments. Okay. Now, Jung's word association experiments measured the patient's physiological responses via their reaction times to a list of chosen words and then analyzing the results. In doing this, he demonstrated the reality and autonomy of unconscious complexes. This realization not only proved that unconscious factors are at work within us, it led him to discover the universal human substrate of the collective unconscious, the deeper waters inherent to humankind. I'm going to play it, if Christophe is going to help me. I'm going to play a little clip from this film, The Talking Cure, which, of course, added a lot of sex and spicy stuff to the story of Sabina Spielrein and tells us more, or shows you a little bit about what the association, the word association experiments look like. Most of us have done this in our training, I think, as analysts, and it's one of those tests that you go, no, not really. First of all, I know what they're looking for. It's not going to work. We paired off when I was in my training, and it works because it taps into your unconscious, and there's a part of the mind body that is triggered by certain words such that it affects the speed with which you come up with your word. So quite fascinating. Okay, let's play that little clip if we can. I'm going to try.
Vienna.
Woods.
Box.
Bed.
Money.
Bank.
Child.
Soon.
Family.
Unit.
The sound kind of went off on that. It's just the film itself, I guess the sound was low, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
I think most of you have seen this film. Interestingly enough, the name, it was a book that was written before the movie was made, of course, and the name was The Talking Cure, and they changed it to A Dangerous Method in order to lure American audiences.
Uh-huh.
It was Eugen Bleuler who figured out the value of applying the study of association patterns, including measures of attention and feeling tone, to psychotic patients in order to examine the inner workings of their condition scientifically. Bleuler's hypothesis opened the possibility that these patients' hallucinations and delusions had meaning and were not simply byproducts of neurological degeneration. Jung took this discovery much further as he continued his studies, ultimately bridging the hallucinations of some of his patients with archetypal themes. His work at the Burkholtzley was instrumental in his conceptualization of the collective unconscious, one of the foundational concepts of his work. A prototypical example of this development in Jung's thinking arose through his work with a schizophrenic patient known as the solar phallus man. In 1906, one of his patients at the hospital had been diagnosed as an incurable paranoid schizophrenic. This man was uneducated and at times very disturbed, but during quiet periods, he was able to communicate his visions and ideas to the doctors. One day, Jung discovered him standing by the window, moving his head from side to side and blinking into the sun. The patient brought Jung to the window and entreated him to do the same, as he would then see something interesting. Jung asked what the man was seeing, and the man responded, "Surely, doctor, you will see the tail of the sun's penis. When I move my head to and fro, it moves too, and that is where the wind comes from." At the time, Jung knew nothing of mythology or archaeology. The encounter puzzled him, but he made note of it. About 4 years later, in 1910, when Jung was engrossed in mythological studies, he discovered the well-known philologist. This is a scholar who studies the history of languages and written records, especially through literature, Albrecht Dietrich's A Mithras Liturgy, in which he recognized the delusional material of his former patient. This book, from a famous Paris library, published a Greek papyrus dealing with a Mithraic ritual for the first time. The relevant passage, as Jung excerpted it, reads as follows: "Draw breath from the rays, Draw in 3 times as strongly as you can, and you will seem to be in the middle of the aerial region. The path of the visible gods will appear through the disk of the sun, who is God my Father. Likewise, there will be seen a so-called tube, the origin of the mistering wind. For you will see hanging down from the disk of the sun something that looks like a tube. And toward the region westward, it is as though there were an infinite east wind. But if the other wind should prevail toward the regions of the east in like fashion, you will see the vision veering in that direction. The striking similarity between the hallucination of his patient and the Mithraic liturgy prompted Jung to investigate further, leading to his discovery of many parallels between motifs in the mythologies of various ethnic groups and the visions and dreams of people who had never heard of them. This led him to conclude that there are myth-forming structural elements in the unconscious. This realization was instrumental to his understanding of the collective unconscious and the archetypes. It also suggests that this kind of autonomous expression of psyche is involved in producing the hallucinations and delusions of schizophrenia. Jung's discovery that this man's psychotic fantasy was in fact a myth was monumental. This raised it to a meaningful story instead of just a madman's delusion to be dismissed, ignored, feared, or medicated away. This discovery and Jung's attitude about it, in a sense, humanized psychosis. At least ideologically, such a discovery had the potential to impact prevailing emotional responses to schizophrenia, the terrain of the Schizophrenia Complex. Jung's observation suggested that while we may perceive people with schizophrenia as different in kind, they are but different in degree. He later profoundly expressed his unique capacity to relate to his own irrational interiority in the Red Book. Universally, we human beings are myth-making creatures. There's that illustration again from Edinger, the ego and archetype. Also bridging from the word association studies, in the early 1900s, Jung determined, and this parallels some of what I'm sharing today, that effective treatment for schizophrenia needed to incorporate, even emphasize, a restoration and strengthening of the ego to bracket and organize the unconscious contents that are constellated in schizophrenia. Jung wrote, "The complex has an abnormal autonomy in hysteria and a tendency to an active, separate existence, which reduces and replaces the constellating power of the ego complex." Of course, he says hysteria, we can extrapolate to schizophrenia. I'm going to touch on theories because I don't think any discussion about schizophrenia or related topics is complete without some mention of theories and medication, but those are not my emphasis. I'm giving a nod. So we talked about Kraepelin's word dementia praecox, which says it all. Basically saw the symptoms of what we call schizophrenia as an early form of dementia. Bleuler did use the term schizophrenia, which was significant. Talked about a split mind, a splitting of psychic as opposed to neurological functioning. So there's a difference. And then ego psychology. This is the school of psychoanalysis rooted in Freud's structural id-ego, superego model of the mind. The implications of that approach or that perspective were that causality had to do with parenting. You may have heard the term refrigerator mother. And that attitude had devastating effects on families who felt ashamed because if their child turned out that way, it must be something wrong with them, basically. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Lang and Perry, who represent a complete polar opposite view to that of the medical model in an interesting and refreshing way. Okay. So bearing in mind that far left has been written and researched about encounters with schizophrenia than about schizophrenia itself, there are many, many theories. To note, the various clinical approaches to working with psychosis are inevitably influenced by our feelings and emotional responses to the phenomenon, along with our intellectual ideas. Findings from Jung's word association experiment became fundamental to diagnosing dementia praecox, as well as to renaming the disease schizophrenia. The renaming is significant, representing a theoretical paradigm shift. Kraepelin's term dementia praecox literally translates to mean early dementia. He believed the condition to be mainly a brain disease, a form of dementia. Bleuler's term schizophrenia is from the Greek schizo, which means split, and phrene, which is mind. He identified positive and negative symptoms and emphasized affective and psychological factors contributing to a splitting of psychic as opposed to neurological functioning. For the past several decades, there have been various international movements to change the terminology of the schizophrenic condition. You see what happened when we just said the word. So language matters. Since 1993, for instance, a movement has been afoot in Japan to replace the name schizophrenia with integration disorder. I bet that wouldn't make us feel all chilly if we closed our eyes and said it. Among other alternatives, essentially in hopes of reducing the stigma associated with the label. Ego psychology, and I talked about what that is. And that theoretical perspective perceives such a framework, which is the structural id, ego, superego model of the mind that Freud, of course, introduced. That framework underlies an individual's interactions with the external world, as well as their responses to internal forces. Historically, adherents of ego psychology focused on the ego's normal and pathological development, its management of libidinal and aggressive impulses, and its adaptation to reality. For decades, the ideas of ego psychologists held sway in the fields of medical science and psychiatry. Unfortunately, though, while those ideas were academically sound and sophisticated, their implications regarding the causality of schizophrenia had devastating results for schizophrenic children and their families. These theorists posited that if the physical care of an infant was survivable, but emotionally he or she were deserted or pushed beyond coping capacity, the infant would become autistic or schizophrenic or die. Attributing psychosis to parental failure is consistent with the theoretical perspective that the genesis of schizophrenia is an emotional and psychological defense response. Not surprisingly, this attitude ultimately evoked guilt and shame for affected families. Parents, especially mothers, and their lack of adequate parenting were blamed for the disorder. They were considered guilty of causing it, and the identified patient was perceived as damaged goods as a result. The family carried the shame of both the inadequate parenting and the ill child. That emotional climate was fertile ground for the development of schizophrenia complexes, as the entire subject was understandably nearly intolerable for those impacted by it. Hence, from the late 1940s to the early 1970s, schizophrenia was widely believed by psychologists to be a deliberate defense mechanism, a psychotic reaction to years of malicious and undermining parenting by the so-called refrigerator mother. This was an essentially ego psychology viewpoint, excuse me, theorizing that schizophrenia developed when a child did not successfully connect with the mother. During that time, the concept of the schizophrenogenic mother as the cause of schizophrenia was popular in the psychiatric literature. From the perspective of my own experience with my son, certainly with the onset of his symptoms, I racked my brain trying to decipher all I had or had not done to warrant this extremely unwelcome turn of events. In regard to the refrigerator mother idea, I was never unavailable or emotionally disconnected from my children. I felt no shame about my son's condition, only fear and worry about his safety, and deep sadness about the shattering of my preconceived picture of his future and, by extension, our families. As a parent, guilt comes naturally and easily for me, but I also realize that guilt and shame lead nowhere, but to more of the same, eventually resulting in a kind of soul-stymieing self-pity that helps no one. Taking responsibility is another matter. Jung encouraged us neither to deny nor try to redeem our sins, but instead to carry them. Part of dealing with my own schizophrenia complex has involved holding enough tolerance for my perceived culpability for my son's condition to remain curious about it. As kitchen appliance analogies go, I was no refrigerator, but more of an oven. The ego psychology idea that refrigerator mothers are essentially to blame may be a destructive patriarchal misreading rather than a complete inaccuracy, falling short but containing an important truth. The relationship with parents is inarguably influential. In my case, for example, the oven may have been too hot. Upon reflection, perhaps I was too intense a parent to my son for reasons of my own, invested and involved in his inner and outer life in ways he experienced as psychological pressure. This insight is most useful not as one-sided shaming or blaming, but as a field phenomenon of the psychological relationship between the child and the parents, perhaps particularly the mother, and the development of what we call schizophrenia. There appears to be a link, but not a linear one, and not a clear causality. I want to share a little bit about the views of R.D. Laing and John Weir Perry that represent an important radical shift in the theoretical perspective about schizophrenia. And this is from the book. Scottish psychiatrist Ronald David Laing, he born in 1927 and died in 89, usually cited as R.D. Laing, and Jungian analyst and psychiatrist John Weir Perry, 1914 to 1998, studied and wrote extensively on the experience of psychosis. Their perspectives presented a stark contrast to the normative medical model of the definition, meaning, and best treatment of schizophrenia. So every extreme constellates its opposite. Scottish psychiatrist Ronald David Laing views on the causes and treatment of psychopathological phenomena were influenced by his study of existential philosophy and ran absolutely counter to the chemical and electroshock methods that have become standard practice. He argued that insanity could be a creative and adaptive response to the world and developed the theory that mental illness was actually an escape mechanism that allowed individuals to free themselves from intolerable circumstances, primarily emotional and psychological. What one experiences as intolerable emotionally and psychologically is a subjective reality not always evident from the outside. By way of illustration, at the point of my son's departure, despite his seemingly more than tolerable lifestyle, he still experienced an intolerable state of unrest. His leaving for Venice Beach was a literal and symbolic gesture of this truth, his subjective, inarguable truth, regardless of how anyone from the outside may have perceived his circumstances. Perceiving the expressed feelings of the individual patient as valid descriptions of their lived experience, rather than as symptoms of mental illness, Lang regarded schizophrenia as a theory rather than a fact. He was considered a rebel in the field of psychiatry, and perhaps he brought a fitting, even necessary, polar opposite attitude to the prevailing, condemning cultural response to mental illness. He wrote, "If the human race survives, future men will, I suspect, look back on our enlightened epoch as a veritable age of darkness. They will see that what was considered schizophrenic was one of the forms in which, often through quite ordinary people, the light began to break into our all too closed minds." Perry authored many books, including The Self and Psychotic Process, The Heart of History, and Trials of the Visionary Mind. Known as a radical thinker in the mental health field, Perry believed that schizophrenia had benefits and that psychotic states could lead to higher consciousness if allowed to run its course. He described how stress may cause highly activated mythic images to erupt from the psyche's deepest levels in the form of turbulent visionary experience. Depending on whether the interactions between the individual and their immediate surroundings lean toward affirmation or invalidation, comprehension of these visions can turn the visionary experience either into a step toward growth or into a psychotic disorder. Based on his clinical and scholarly investigations, Perry conceptualized a mental syndrome that, though customarily regarded as acute psychosis, is actually a natural effort of the psyche to mend its imbalances. Consequently, according to Perry, if the upset is received in the spirit of empathy and understanding and allowed to run its course, an acute episode can be found to reveal a self-organizing process that has healing potential. Jungians might call this an example of the self-regulation of the psyche, a function in waking life that is analogous to dreams. Perry noted the function of mythic themes, rituals of antiquity, and the visionary experiences undergone by prophets and social reformers in various ages and parts of the world as representative of this mysterious phenomenon and relevant to understanding it. A common denominator in all theorizing about schizophrenia is our deep human need to solve essentially insoluble mysteries, or at least agree about a meaning. When such efforts fail, unwanted emotions can be triggered and a complex likely ensues. Part of the revulsion and avoidance that surrounds schizophrenia is the archetypal frustration constellated by our inability fully to understand or to solve it. An encounter with schizophrenia reminds us of our ultimate humility before the unconscious, that great sea that rumbles always beneath our neat lives. Not always so neat. So alchemical implications, the state of solutio. So in many references, the whole opus, the work of individuation, is summarized by the phrase dissolve and coagulate. Just as calcinatio pertains to the element fire, coagulatio to the element earth, and sublimatio to the element air, so solutio pertains to water. All that is stuck is put in solution to allow movement. It is used to symbolize softening or melting processes, representative of dissolution, dispersal, and even dismemberment. For the alchemist, solutio was a process by which the differentiated matter returned to its original undifferentiated state, the prima materia. Alchemical recipes for the solutio operation give us an image of a descent into the unconscious. It is the prima materia prior to the differentiation of the elements by consciousness. So what we call schizophrenia could be described as the immersion of the ego in the unconscious, a form of dissolution, which of course corresponds to the alchemical stage of solutio. Edinger suggested that this state of immersion in the undifferentiated waters of the unconscious is necessary for positive transformation and actually corresponds to the process of a successful therapy or analysis, which examines the products of the unconscious and puts the established ego attitudes into question. There are various ways in which this immersion in the unconscious can occur, the outcome of which depends largely upon the relative stability of the ego. One may undergo a figurative trial by dismemberment via descent into the unconscious, from which a fairly well-developed ego would subsequently emerge. Or one may undergo a blissful but dangerous process that fits Erich Neumann's concept of Ouroboros incest, in which an immature ego might be engulfed. In order for things to work out in the aftermath of any form of psychic dissolution, a next stage of coagulatio must follow, whereby Edinger said, quote unquote, archetypal contents are egoized. In other words, according to Jung, the ego recovers sufficient consolidation to be central to the person's experience, which is then organized around it. In therapy or analysis, this next stage is promoted by a good enough therapist or analyst. Edinger further stated, the extreme failure of the archetypal images to become concretized, in other words, when one is stuck in solutio, is found in overt schizophrenia. The ego is literally inundated by boundless primordial archetypal images. Such an individual has had inadequate opportunity to experience the archetypes mediated and personalized through human relationships. That last statement really tripped me. It implies a strong psychological and developmental component to schizophrenia. This statement is also loaded because it seems to suggest causality between the opportunity or lack thereof for effective interpersonal relationships and schizophrenia. This reasoning does not apply to everyone who suffers from the condition. What of the individual who has had such relationships, has had the opportunity for them, and then appears to lose the capacity to maintain them? Then the dissolution might be a sort of alchemical reversal, the apparent regression into solutio of contents that seemed to have successfully reached the stage of coagulatio. Yet, a descent into solutio from a stage of coagulatio may not be a reversal. It may be part of an ongoing cyclical process, even of individuation, a process that develops over a lifetime with innumerable iterations. We go back and forth. Jung referred to the importance of dissolution of the persona for individuation, the process of becoming whole, one's true self. Such a stage represents a necessary breakdown of the commitment to collective ideals or old defensive patterns that mask deeper individuality, as Jung described the process. I regard the loss of balance as purposive, since it replaces a defective consciousness by the automatic and instinctive activity of the unconscious, which is aiming all the time at the creation of new balance and will moreover achieve this aim, provided that the conscious mind is capable of assimilating the contents produced by the unconscious, i.e., of understanding and digesting them. Thus, the state of disintegration or solutio may well lead to a state of chaos for the individual that may then lead to a new state of coagulatio. The way Edinger talked about the stages of solutio and coagulatio in schizophrenia is reductive, limiting, and linear. Sometimes those stages are neither sequential nor predictable. Jung referred to the stages of early development in terms of the child's psychic emergence from the unconscious, intermittently challenged by the world of the archetypes. A child with a growing healthy ego develops the sense of a differentiated I, separate from parents. Jung wrote, "In the childish stage of consciousness, there are as yet no problems. Nothing depends upon the subject, for the child itself is still fully dependent upon its parents. It is as though they were not completely born, but were still enclosed in the psychic atmosphere of its parents. Psychic birth, and with it, the conscious differentiation from the parents, only takes place at puberty, sometimes later. For most people, it is the demands of life which harshly put an end to the dreams of childhood. If the individual is sufficiently well prepared, the transition to a profession or career can take place smoothly. But if he clings to illusions that are contrary to reality, then problems will surely arise." It's an interesting way to look at it. "My son had periodic archetypal experiences consistent with a normal growing up and demonstrated the capacity to operate with healthy emerging ego stability in response to these challenges. He was able to avoid clinging to illusions that are contrary to reality. He had a sufficient relational container to allow him to integrate these early developmental archetypal experiences until his early 20s. Since his descent into solutio at that point in his life, now that he is late 30s, actually he's now a little older than that, he has a newfound sense of coagulatio. I think it is a synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence, that the onset of what we call schizophrenia often coincides with the entry into young adulthood at the crucial juncture when real-world demands for independence are intensified. Some individuals enter young adulthood with a well enough developed ego and balanced enough ego-self relationship to navigate the flood of archetypal contents that accompany this crucial milestone. Then there are those for whom the balance is off, leaving them inadequately prepared. Such an individual then clings to illusions that are contrary to reality, as Jung stated, and quote unquote problems will surely arise. Perhaps the containing parental frame has been insufficient, or perhaps they have experienced the opposite, a too comfortable nest. Faced with an inevitable crossroads, each individual's experience represents a unique confluence of factors. These include not only environmental circumstances like stress and relational and family history, but also sensitivity, character, personality, biology, and timing. Due to the synergistic influence of these inner and outer factors at the brink of adulthood, an individual may be ill-equipped to handle the challenge of any ego-conscious choice toward maturation in the real world with equanimity. Readiness is key. The lure of the imaginal realm of childhood must be navigated to allow a working relationship between fantasy and reality, between the conscious and unconscious dimensions of our existence, in order to move forward into the next stage of maturation. At least psychologically, emotionally, and perhaps spiritually, the processes of solutio and coagulatio happen not only once, but repeatedly through a lifetime. This may be why we revisit the same issues at different stages of our lives. Given this perspective, a schizophrenic experience of solutio might not be a failure as much as an indication that yet another coagulatio is needed. This cyclical perspective allows the possibility that people with schizophrenia can get better. And this actually flies in the face of every theory within mainstream psychiatry. There was a scene I describe in the book. My son was working in our offices, the treatment facility, and a friend of ours, psychiatrist, came in who had known him forever, before, during, and after, and had a conversation. And my son looked at him, direct eye contact, smiling, and the way he was. And he took my husband aside. He said, there's no way he has schizophrenia. Well, because he couldn't put the two things together. That this was also true. I have to put in a little. I don't want to be a downer, but honestly, the take home here is not so much that, oh, good, we found a solution. It's that it goes up and down. Yeah, and maybe the dips into the unconscious for someone who has this kind of relationship with it are even more unpredictable and perhaps more frequent than for the rest of us, with no guarantees. I think it's time for another little break.
Mm-hmm.
So let's do that and
Yes.
come back. And
So we'll come back at 11:05.
that sounds good. So there are many different images that represent what we call schizophrenia. Of course, alchemy, mythology, fairy tales. I give examples of those in the book. I'm obviously not going to go into all of that during our time together, but I do want to talk a little bit about schizophrenia, the role of affect in mythology. The dynamic interchange between chaos and order is fundamental to what we call schizophrenia, as well as the emotions constellated by an encounter with the phenomenon. If chaos represents the state of schizophrenia, then order corresponds to the ego consolidation necessary to restabilize. Our emotional responses to order are usually egosyntonic. We like it. Not so to chaos. Chaos is usually experienced as threatening. When the level of threat is felt to be intolerable, it's likely to go into a complex. You probably recognize Icarus. One myth from ancient Greece containing these disparate elements is the classic story of Icarus. His father is the master craftsman, Daedalus, creator of the labyrinth. Icarus and his father attempt to escape from Crete using wings Daedalus had constructed from feathers and wax. Daedalus warns Icarus not to fly either too low or too high, lest the sea's dampness clog the wings or the sun's heat melt them. But Icarus does fly too close to the sun. His wings melt, and he tumbles from the sky into the ocean, where he drowns. This image is an archetypal backdrop for the story of schizophrenia. The myth of Icarus can be construed as a warning against complacency or insufficient libido, which would be flying too low, or hubris, flying too high, but it also suggests what can happen when affect goes unregulated. Metaphorically, the wax holding our wings together melts and we can no longer keep on course and steer. We lose navigation of our lives. As an archetypal image, the sun can represent enlightenment, creativity, energy, and spiritual wisdom, but getting too close to it, becoming inflated, and losing a balanced perspective can burn and destroy. The capacity to regulate affect is compromised in schizophrenia. Affect becomes disconnected from ego consciousness. Icarus, learning to fly in the middle, not too low or too high, could be understood as a metaphor for finding the necessary balance between consciousness and unconsciousness. His tipping too high destroys his ability to navigate at all. This is a metaphor for the seductive exhilaration associated with madness. Icarus meets his ultimate destruction by drowning in the ocean. In other words, he plummets into the sea of the unconscious. We can imagine poor grieving Daedalus would have been left with a schizophrenia complex, his affect laden with guilt, shame, frustration, and deep sorrow. Yeah, so I was going to talk about medication. I will give it a nod. So I talked about Perry and Lang and their approach, which is so radically non-invasive and different, opposite from traditional psychiatric approaches, which included historically electroshock therapy and then antipsychotics. And of course, we're coming up with new forms of antipsychotic medication regularly. I really didn't find anywhere in the real world where it was possible to experiment safely with allowing the illness to run its course without medication in the interests of promoting its meaning as a creative adaptation and inviting higher consciousness. And that's not to say that that isn't a realistic perspective or a dimension of the experience, but finding a resource where one can safely experiment with that approach is something I haven't discovered. I've given these talks before and someone inevitably brings up, well, what about, an Indian tribe they know of, or, a place in Peru, but that it shows that such an approach to the experience is possible, but it doesn't correlate to actual resources, at least that I was able to locate here in So antipsychotic treatments are a heart-rending catch-22 because while they stabilize the ego, they also result in some joylessness, a blunted experience of life. And I will talk a little about that. Anhedonia, and I'll say it somewhere in the context of what I share with you. Anhedonia is joylessness. Anosognosia, that second term, has to do with the absolute belief that nothing's wrong with me. And it's the number one reason why it's so difficult to get someone who's actually having that kind of experience to take medication. So this is a quote that talks about or I think expresses the catch-22 of anhedonia, that joylessness, from my son. I can feel the subject of love, but not the meaning. I do feel love, but I don't feel it to the full extent because of medication. Medication is a very strong component. Anhedonia, loss of pleasure, is the worst part or side effect, feeling nothing and not wanting to do anything, no excitement, no positives. Looking back, I remember enjoying food, coffee, drinking, eating, sensory pleasures. I can't feel it in my body. I had free feelings then, years ago, prior to medication. I miss it in a way, and I don't. Not on meds, I had more energy, but I can't live in society. The dream world is fun, but I have to take medication. I enjoy having stability. The medication literally saves me. When I started taking medication, it kind of put up a barrier between me and the world. It became difficult to engage with people. Even to this day, I still struggle with gatherings. When I was off medication, I was a chatterbox to everyone I didn't know, but I was talking as if I was a chicken with my head cut off. I aim to please. When I'm in a situation where it's uncouth to be who I really am, I will behave because I care about people and how they'll feel. The prospect of utilizing antipsychotic medication presents a paradoxical dilemma. Getting someone to take medication initially is all but impossible, since a characteristic symptom of psychosis is the gut-level firm conviction that they absolutely do not need help or intervention. And that's that term anosognosia, which means lack of insight. It's a symptom of severe mental illness that impairs a person's ability to understand and perceive his or her own illness. It's the single largest reason why people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder refuse medications or do not seek treatment. Affect and stress are key factors in schizophrenia and in the schizophrenia complex. Without medication, regulating the runaway affect of someone with schizophrenia is usually impossible. Medication can make it possible for the person to regain enough stability to function in the world, even meaningfully and with varying degrees of independence. But the struggle to find the right relationship with affect, ego, and unconscious remains an ongoing battle between the metaphorical inner and outer forces of chaos and order. Sensitivity, reactivity, a delicate balance is going on here, even with meds. This affective fragility is ever present for someone who has these symptoms, and can result in hypervigilance, not only from a person who has had the experience, oh no, is it happening again, but from people around them who care and are going to be watching with an intensity that they might not otherwise, and not only that other person, but monitoring themselves. So hypervigilance. Even under the heavy hammer of antipsychotic medication, when somebody with schizophrenia encounters undue stress, the delicate balance between chaos and order can be destabilized. Although a functional level of ego consciousness can be regained, such individuals live with an ongoing awareness of their own psychic and affective fragility, warranting a special kind of hypervigilance, in itself a form of schizophrenia complex that brings its own challenges apart from the actual symptoms of the illness. Those closest to such an individual are inevitably aware of this dynamic and experience an ongoing background condition of amplified alert. This ever-present background thrum characterizes their own schizophrenia complexes, often extending from worries about the loved one with schizophrenia to heightened awareness of their own psychic and affective fragility. No one gets away for free. This is a whole talk unto itself, and we're going to give it a nod here. Nathan Schwartz-Salant, whom I'm guessing most of you know, has done some wonderful writing on the subject of working with individuals that have psychosis. And this is a quote from him. The tendency in analysis is to sidestep the act of experiencing and embracing psychotic aspects of a patient's personality is all too common. An analyst's desire to employ understanding and thus avoid the experience of emptiness and dissociative chaos is difficult to put aside. But Jung's psychology encourages us to do just that. And then from Jung, one should not underrate the disastrous shock which patients undergo when they find themselves assailed by the intrusion of strange contents which they are unable to integrate. The mere fact that they have such ideas isolates them from their fellow men and exposes them to an irresistible panic, which often marks the outbreak of the manifest psychosis. If, on the other hand, they meet with adequate understanding from their physician, they do not fall into a panic because they are still understood by a human being and thus preserved from the disastrous shock of complete isolation. Working with schizophrenia ultimately challenges us to recall Jung's emphasis on learning theory well and then leaving it at the door in order to encounter each client as a unique soul. Consider the following from Jung. As far as possible, I let pure experience decide the therapeutic aims. In psychotherapy, it seems to me positively advisable for the doctor not to have too fixed an aim. He added, every psychotherapist not only has his own method, he himself is that method. The great healing factor in psychotherapy is the doctor's personality. It represents his performance at its highest and not a doctrinaire blueprint. Theories are to be avoided except as mere auxiliaries. As soon as dogma is made out of them, it is evident that an inner doubt is being stifled. If the therapist is in fact the method of therapy, when working with psychotic clients, the nature of the transference will depend upon one's relationship with one's own irrational core. From such a shared stance of not knowing, a feeling of true connection may develop. The therapist's narcissistic need to be in control, to prove his or her strategy right, and to fix the crazy others, even by loving them into conversion, will inevitably fail when treating individuals with what we call schizophrenia. Because the ego consciousness prerequisite for such an approach to work is submerged in such clients. Rather, the therapeutic relationship requires a unique participation mystique, a soulful, demanding, mystical participation. And again, from Schwartz-Salant. This is a great quote, I think. Speaking about a psychotic part is, in a sense, a contradiction. One never experiences psychotic states in another person as if they were a part of the person, as we sometimes speak of a complex. Psychotic states, like the waters of chaos in alchemy or in creation myths, are psychic spaces in which Cartesian language fails. These states readily extend to the analyst, creating a field in which it is not possible to state who is containing the psychotic part. Rather, one deals with a field phenomenon that cannot be reduced to separable structures, not an approach in which one speaks of a patient's psychotic part as if it were in any manner totally separable from the same phenomenon in the analyst. Rather, transference psychosis constellates countertransference psychosis, but in a lesser degree and a more manageable form. That is, if the analysis of these areas is to be successful. I give a couple of examples of how this might look in the book. Such a therapeutic attitude requires the challenging capacity to visit one's own psychotic parts enough to join the client, but in a manageable form in order for the work to progress. The therapist must metaphorically both hold the containing vessel and dive in. Any therapeutic experience is essentially unpredictable. With schizophrenia, that uncertainty is amplified. And this is from Jung in The Practice of Psychotherapy, Volume 16. Therapy aims at strengthening the conscious mind, and whenever possible, I try to rouse the patient to mental activity and get him to subdue the massa confusa of his mind with his own understanding, so that he can reach a vantage point. Au-dessus de la mêlée. I hope I shouldn't butcher that too much. Above the fray. Nobody who ever had any wits is in danger of losing them in the process, although there are people who never knew till then what their wits are for. In such a situation, understanding acts like a lifesaver. It integrates the unconscious, and gradually there comes into being a higher point of view where both conscious and unconscious are represented. Certainly, the extent to which therapists have explored and accepted their own feelings and associations regarding schizophrenia and have depotentiated their own schizophrenia complexes will be pivotal in enduring the work of therapy for both parties. As stated earlier, as therapists, our relationship with our own inner mad parts, with the unconscious, has everything to do with how we confront the phenomenon of what we call schizophrenia in our culture, in our psyches, and certainly in our clients. In some ways, the necessary bridging from the unconscious to consciousness, so fundamental to therapy with such individuals, is a process in which the therapist must not only metaphorically hold the vessel, but also leap into it along with the client. Ultimately and blessedly, such a dive has the potential to be mutually healing. So Jung's writings are replete with references to the connection between the archetypes of the collective unconscious and schizophrenia, and here are just a few samples. The archetypal motifs of the unconscious are the psychic source of delusional ideas, especially of the paranoid schizophrenic forms. In schizophrenics, the collective contents of the unconscious predominate strongly in the form of mythological motifs. When people lose their hold on the concrete values of life, the unconscious contents become overwhelmingly real. Considered from the psychological standpoint, psychosis is a mental condition in which formerly unconscious elements take the place of reality. This is another point I'm hoping you will take with you. Individuals with schizophrenia are vastly different from each other. They are potentially influenced by or identified with archetypes as different as everything else about their personalities and lives, just as is true for those who are not psychotic. Others impacted by those individuals, whether family members or clients or strangers, may develop their own complexes in response and are influenced by archetypes that represent their unique experiences with such an encounter. There is no one universal theme that characterizes the individual experience of schizophrenia other than the undoing of whatever you thought your life story was before you encountered that chaos, either within yourself or in someone you love. I hope you recognize this quote. I'm thinking you probably do. Jung wrote that, or said this days before his death in 1961. Some sources say it was a letter he wrote, others say it was in an interview with Good Housekeeping. In any event, it's a keeper. To this day, God is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path violently and recklessly. All things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life for better or worse. Part of depotentiating the schizophrenia complex is recognizing that we just have to bear life's twists and turns, sometimes without understanding, without knowing the reasons why. Facing schizophrenia invokes all that we do not know and cannot explain, for which we have no known cause or cure. Heroic tenacity in the face of the unknowable, even the intolerable, is a broader archetypal theme interwoven with the story of our lives. Maybe our encounters with schizophrenia and its associated complexes represent an essential truth. Life is what it is, not what we want, need, or hope it will be. Yet the sometimes hidden gold of our tattered existence may lie in the very worst challenges we face. And that is what this quote alludes to, I think. What we call schizophrenia represents an immersion of ego consciousness into the deep pool of the unconscious. If the schizophrenia complex is generated by our panic about all we cannot control or understand, perhaps the potential for healing lies in submitting to the will of that divine tumult to which Jung refers, realizing the potential for individuation therein. Here he is. In the face of devastating upset, in our inevitable encounters with those swipes of fate that cross us violently and recklessly, finding enough gold to persevere is ultimately a matter of faith, perspective, and attitude. Jung's quote suggests that such seemingly arbitrary, mysterious, and upsetting circumstances also express the divine, requiring us to withstand the opposites inherent in our human existence. Eros, the archetypal capacity for relatedness, is also part of our divine inheritance, even necessary and perhaps most when logic fails. In the end, in some fundamental way, if we are to survive, it is Eros who can tip the scales, heal a wounded family tree, a dead dream, a broken heart. In Greek mythology, the god Eros is the personification of love and relatedness, a cosmogonic force of nature. Psychologically, Eros holds the function of relationship. Love is what makes a parent swim out to the deep after a child who has been caught in the undertow. Eros fuels our devotion and profoundly unreasonable tenacity. Love can overrule fear, shock, and sadness, all the emotional territory of the schizophrenia complex. I now understand as never before that sometimes we simply have to submit to our irrational lives and face the reality of what life brings without our permission. To survive, we must drop our expectations in denial, follow where we can, wait when we cannot follow or fix, and stay as long as we are still breathing. We invoke Eros and hold on to love, treading water, one arm gripping the rim of the deep pool. Thank you. Questions in a minute. But first, I'd like you to close your eyes and recall that felt image of an encounter with what we call schizophrenia that you thought of when we started. And please check in with your thoughts and feelings about it now. And I will ask if anybody would like to share if you know anything different, what you've learned, what you will take with you from this shared experience, including Zoomland. Well, let's close our eyes again for just a moment and see what comes up. Check in. Recall an encounter with what we call schizophrenia. Okay. Yeah.
Fear, shattered, scrambled, and the image was struck by lightning.
Did anything, was that the first one from the beginning or?
This is all from the
From
beginning,
the beginning?
Yeah.
What about this time?
just as you said it
Yeah.
now. Only the struck by lightning. I didn't feel the
Okay.
feeling quite as much, but the image came.
That's interesting
Mm-hmm.
because there's no denying the shattering
Yeah.
effect of such an encounter. But what can shift is our attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where Eros comes in. It's
Mhm.
not in terms of logic or fairness or looking for a fix.
Yeah.
Gustav, I really don't know if anybody out in Zoom land is saying anything.
Somebody has a raised hand.
Corey, do you want to unmute yourself? To ask
I
a
am
question?
unmuted. Can you hear me?
Hi, Corey.
Hi, Eve. How are you?
Good to see you again.
Nice seeing you again so soon. The first time I said schizophrenia, it was like this profound activation from about the belly up. I couldn't feel anything deeper. It was just like this. And the second time, it was peace, more of a peaceful acceptance, which enabled this energy to trickle down. So that was pretty phenomenal.
Thank you. That is phenomenal. All right, let's open it up. Any questions? Kind of a long stretch here to try and remember.
I have a lot of questions. What I'm hearing you say, and I want to know where the image of the woman with the snakes, the two faces with the snakes, black and white snakes up above. Do you recall that image?
From the Red Book, and I can't tell you.
It's from the Red Book? Oh my God. I don't think I've ever seen it.
Mm,
Yeah, gotta look.
I don't know. I don't think I have either.
Yeah. When you were talking about, so what I'm hearing is that feelings are both, or connection to feelings are both the poison and the cure, kind of. And that feelings can be embodied in a relationship with someone. So when we were talking about that, when you first see someone and there's that kind of, when you work with someone that has this kind of disorder or someone that's been affected by it, and you make that eye contact and there's that window, that's where a possibility of restoration of affect can occur through the relationship. Okay, I'm just wanting to check out.
I mean, a key point here is that in order to have that window open in such a way that you can both be present in
Yeah.
a shared field, that other individual needs to have the prerequisite ego consciousness,
Mhm.
that kind of stability to where they have some ability to objectively perceive their own inner experience, to have the affect that isn't connected consciousness when one is in that flooded state. Yeah. Now, if you show up and they can't, then that doesn't mean it's a bad idea to show up. And I think that's what Jung did a lot with his patients. That's what it's written, is that he would simply be there with them. And I mean, you're not always going to get a signal that there's a recognition, but who knows? You know, so it requires a lot of patience, to be sure. And there's a lot of inconsistency. It's not like it's not a solvable problem.
No.
Yeah.
Thank you. Charles.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Charles.
Hi, Eve. I've been sitting with practically almost everything you talked about. I've been sitting with a case that seems to be a good example, Would that be okay if I shared a little bit of that? Um, it's got some rather graphic content, so I just want to prepare you all for that. But this was the second person I ever saw in my life, and that was in 1978 when I was 28 years old. And it was my second year of graduate school. I had done a year of internship and assessment, and now this was my first year doing psychotherapy. And I was assigned to a place called the Center for Legal Psychiatry. And I worked with mentally disordered sex offenders and people found not guilty by reason of insanity. So, just as a little context about my countertransference going into that, this is a very serious population, and I had a lot of fear. My first patient, a white man who was not guilty by reason of insanity, came in and after 10 minutes said to me, "You know, I don't like you, and the next time I'm going to bring a shotgun in and blow your head off." So I immediately went down to my supervisor, and what this man secretly wished was to stay in jail, and he got his wish after such a statement. So my going into my second case, you can imagine how I was feeling and wondering about my competency here with this kind of population. And this was a black man who walked in, had a very severe tardive dyskinesia, which is a symptom of antipsychotics, and would not look at me. He sat down, was very quiet, and I just waited, and I felt panic. I didn't know what I was going to do, or it rightfully felt I had no idea what to do with this man. The first thing out of his mouth, still not looking at me, he said, God is giving me a blowjob right now. At which point, inside, I completely panicked. But I took a few deep breaths and I heard in a voice inside of me. And I repeated it to him. I didn't tell him it was a voice. I just looked at him and said, "Well, then you must be very important." At which point he looked at me. And from there, we began to have some contact. And that lasted for a few months. He lived down by USC in some kind of public supported place. He was not guilty by reason of insanity, so it was kind of a supervised place. And one day he didn't come. I went to the administrative office and said he didn't come. I guess you weren't told that he's not coming anymore. He moved and they can't provide him transportation over to Santa Monica to see you. So I called the place and said, I want to set up an appointment. I'm going to come down there and talk to him. And we set that up. I drove down and we sat out on the stoop of his apartment building. And he looked at me and said, I don't think, I don't think anybody ever cared about me that much to do this. Yeah. And so that was essentially the content of our last session. So I think you can understand some of the reasons I bring this up. You know, I was thrown by the circumstances of my um, internship, the prior case, and then the severity of this man's situation into an utter panic. And somehow I think that opened me to hear an archetypal voice that spoke to him and created some order there for him and enabled him to make some human contact through his eyes to me.
Mm.
So I want to thank you because you helped me put that together and formulate that in a much more coherent way for myself.
What a beautiful story.
Mm.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And what a perfect example of just what I had hoped to convey.
Mm.
You know.
Yes, I think, we sometimes have this urgency to interpret upwards into the ego to make sense. But I think that I don't take credit for that interpretation. It came to me from a deeper source, an archetypal source. I was available to it, but I feel like we stayed. He was not aware that he was talking symbolically, but I was in a sense, and we stayed in the language of the symbol, which I think is where the schizophrenic is inside symbolic language, not outside of it.
That's a beautiful analysis. And quite honestly, I think that the transformative ingredient in that encounter was the fact that you did care, that you went out of your way. You weren't just available to try and understand him. Your heart was open to him, and he knew it. He felt it. Mm-hmm. Now, can we guarantee that every time that's going to happen? No, but boy, when it shows up, let's pay attention. It's pure gold. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
So being a bit inspired by Charles, and also thinking about a case this entire time, working with a man I love very much, who's in his late 40s, but had what he calls his illness in college in his 20s. Electric shock, institutions. Mm-hmm. He was very identified with what he can't touch anymore from his genius at 20 before he got ill. But I'm now wanting to think symbolically because his mother controls his treatment at this point. Mm-hmm. And he tried to make a move into Jungian psychiatry where things could be treated symbolically, but his mother won't let him. Mm-hmm. So I'm stuck on the concreteness of that as a block. And I'd love to think about how to hold it symbolically so there's some space around it, right? Like,
well, you're seeing him in analysis?
Oh, yeah, I am.
Yes.
But she controls his medication. She controls his psychiatry. She wouldn't let him see the psychiatrist I recommended because.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I don't know that medication from anyone who prescribes it still comes with some, as we've talked about a little bit, of certain advantages and then also some built-in disadvantages. Right. So I'm glad to hear that you're working with him because it sounds like you're already doing that. You are encouraged. You're giving him a safe place where he can explore the symbolic world from a heart place with you, and maybe how he copes with his mother, and not just. I mean, that's a lot, right? His mother is still in charge of. I mean, that in and of itself. I mean, as has also come up today in our discussion, there are many aspects of anyone who has this illness that are as different as the different dimensions of any of us. So if we had somebody who didn't have schizophrenia, whose mother was still in charge of his medical arrangements and making those kinds of decisions, and he was subject to that and didn't feel empowered to take that on him. And I'm not saying that go do that. I'm just saying that's an issue, isn't it? It's a psychological issue. We sometimes get so, and we need to pay attention to the largeness of this range of symptoms because it is potentially overwhelming. That doesn't mean all that other stuff isn't going on too. And so, I mean, that's what comes up for me listening to this is that you are already piece. And you can't change his mom, but you could possibly work on that relationship and who's doing what and how he feels about it, the same way you would with any other 40-year-old man, right, whose mom was very involved.
Yeah, I feel like I needed to ask it to get to
Yeah.
create the space because I wasn't seeing him like any other man whose mother was controlling him.
There's that too.
Thank you.
It's not an either or, it's a both and, as we
Yeah.
like to say. Okay.
Yeah, on this,
Michael, do you want to unmute yourself?
it looks like Charles has something else too.
You're still muted.
I'm not here.
Oh, there we go. Just a brief comment on, was that Marlena who was speaking? I can't see anybody who's live there.
Charles.
What I experienced with that mother was that order chaos dichotomy, because on one hand she's holding this very strict order, but that maintains a chaotic space for him. Because she won't allow him to internalize an order, which Marlena's suggestion would help with. The other thing, Marlena, in a way, could possibly be seen as the other mother, who is allowing for a certain chaos, which would, when allowed, creates a new order. So I think to me, that's the symbolic background. And just to have the awareness of that goes from the analyst's unconscious into the unconscious of the patient. And that feels very valuable in my humble opinion.
Thank you. That is lovely. It's a good catch.
Michael's trying to unmute himself. Can you unmute him, Christoph?
No.
Not yet.
There's a button at the bottom left of your screen to unmute yourself. You can click on it.
Not yet.
Still muted. If you want to send your question by chat, you can also do it.
Do you want to type it in, Michael? Can't hear you.
Mute. Can you
There
hear
we
me?
go.
Oh, and visually it's okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much for a really illuminating talk. And, I know you from your two books now. And it occurred to me listening to you now that your life has been sandwiched between two generations of the most intense phenomena that come up in psychotherapy. Your first book was about your father and his narcissism, and now you got the opposite generation, your son. So kudos on that. That's really must be something very profound and testing. And I wouldn't mind just hearing your response to how you balance one of these in your life is enough, but to have both, I wouldn't mind hearing a little bit about that. The other two things I'd like to say that came up for me. When I was in undergraduate school, the faculty of religious studies brought Artie Lang out to do a seminar. It was a real big thing. We were all waiting for it. He had just come back from something like a year in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery. And he spoke, and then at the end of his talk, he took questions and answers. And he became persecuting and insulting to the students and to their questions. And it was, he seemed very inflated and resentful that he had to be there, I suppose, as he thought about it. And then a few months later, we heard he had died. And he died pretty young, actually. I think he was in his late 50s. That's the thing that also caught me about your presentation, is that because schizophrenia can also manifest as a complex, it by nature is contagious. And I'm wondering what he caught, Artie Lang caught, in a contagious way that made him go from the man we read about in his books to that experience. And as we all know, he was primarily a therapeutic scholar of schizophrenia. And the last thing I'll like to say, and then hear back from you a little bit, I use a mini Mac. It's a little workhorse of a computer. And I know how it feels at different times, quote unquote, how it feels, a machine. But I have now, coming and going, touched the top of my computer. It's a top, you can keep it on your desk, this computer. It's like frying hot. I've never touched this computer this hot. I'm a little concerned it's going to burn or blow up. So I think the contagiousness is also something that's supernatural. So anyways, thank you again for a great presentation.
Michael, thank you. And that was a lot. Yes, well, synchronicity isn't just an abstract concept, right? It's a life of living here with us, and this is intense stuff. Yeah, I didn't hear a question with that piece about R.D. Lang, but that certainly is interesting. And yeah, it's an interesting idea. We'll never know, but it does seem that in terms of like the way Schwartz-Salant talked about the doing work with an individual who is in these waters, that there is something going on that level. And it may be that while Lang's insights were tremendous and educating, there was a layer going on that, of course, was personal and not within his control. That much seems likely. You asked about being sandwiched in between two different kinds of severe mental problems. Well, different sides of my family, and my father, honestly, like narcissism, and even the way I wrote about psychopathy is it's easier for me than this. I mean, this is a completely different dimension of my experience. I don't know how I got so lucky, but there you have it. I mean, my daughter told me, just don't write anymore about anybody in our family. But I am really honored that all of you showed up. That's how I really feel in this moment. And it is a difficult subject, and appreciate you. I think we're about. Are there anybody else?
Any other questions on Zoom or in the room? Charles.
Very short. I don't want to dominate with speaking too much here, but John Weir Perry had a place called Diabasis House. Are you aware of that, Eve? Yeah, so he's the only one I know who made attempts to approach this in a different way, without use of medication, a small patient population, a large professional population working with these people. Really following the fantasies, painting all the fantasies, and he claims to have had some success. I also want to say, and then John also got into a lot of trouble, and I think sometimes ethical trouble, and I think sometimes we have to remember about the shadow side of this breaking open of the borders of the unconscious into this territory that is very, very wild.
That's right. Yeah, thank you for bringing that in. And just quickly, the association that came up for me when you were saying that is that I've had a couple, but it showed up in terms of some difficulties with Perry from what you've said, and I did hear something about that, but it showed up for Lang in a different way. Yeah, so.
Yes, it did. I also met R.D. Lang. He spoke at my university, and I was at a gathering afterwards, and he could barely speak. He was on LSD. He had a handler with him, and when someone asked him a question, he would whisper the answer into the handler's ear, who would give the response.
Oh my gosh. He was drifting.
He was drifting, yes.
I'm sorry, Elizabeth.
No, I was just gonna, when my first, even before the internship, what is that called? Traineeship, they used to call it back in the day. I worked in in Pine Grove Hospital long time ago in the 90s. And one of my first patients, I was working in the locked adult facility, and I was about to do my first psychosocial with a guy that was just brought in. And I sat down with him, and a supervisor was in the room with me, and he was in the middle of a psychotic episode, and he was Jesus, and he was talking about all of his learnings, all of the things that he had to spread love and tell, the world population about. And I was so swept up in it. I bought it for a moment that he knew something. And I asked him, could you tell me a little bit about what that is? And my supervisor tapped me. She was like, no. And I could feel myself, the shadow side that Charles was just talking about kind of deflate.
Yeah.
Because, I had to do that. And I didn't get to do what I thought at the time was kind of yummy. I mean, like, duh. I was just not, so that piece, I was swept up immediately. It's so powerful. So learning how to take a few grains of that, enlivening, like, and keep it tempered can be really hard.
Right.
When you're in the presence of that.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's seductive.
It's very seductive. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Charles Seltzer's hands are applauding.
Yes, yay, Charles.
He's
Yay.
Okay, that's fine.
Showed up.